The pup weighed almost nothing, but the heat coming off its body could have blistered paint. Ilara felt it through the layers of wet burlap she had wrapped around her forearms, a fever so intense the cloth was already drying, stiffening against her skin like paper left too close to a hearth. The pup whimpered a sound like a rusted hinge and pressed its muzzle into the hollow of her throat, where her pulse hammered. Around her, the refugee camp had pulled back like a tide, retreating from something dead on the shore. 40 feet of empty ground in every direction. That was what plague brought you. She had been the one to find it 3 hours ago, wedged beneath the overturned supply cart where someone had shoved it, probably hoping it would die quietly and save everyone the trouble of a decision. A wolf pup, no bigger than a bread loaf, its fur the color of smoke, threaded with veins of dull gold, its eyes sealed shut with the yellowish crust that everyone in the Northlands knew on sight. Ash blood fever. The plague that had emptied 4 packs in 2 winters and turned the word quarantine into something that tasted like a prayer. Nobody would touch it. Nobody would even look at it for longer than a breath. Ilara had picked it up anyway, because she had spent 7 years as the overnight attendant in the pack's quarantine ward, the one who changed the soiled linens and spooned broth into mouths that could no longer swallow, and she had never caught a single sickness. Not once. The healers called it dumb luck. Her former alpha had called it a useful deficiency, the way you might call a mule useful for not needing shoes. She had stopped trying to explain it to anyone. Now the pup was burning alive in her arms, and the refugees were watching her from behind their cook fires with the specific expression she had memorized years ago. Not hatred exactly, something flatter. The look people give a stray dog eating garbage. A recognition that you exist coupled with the firm intention to do absolutely nothing about it. She didn't know that the supply cart the pup had been hidden under bore the crest of the Blackmere Royal Pack. She didn't know that the pup's fur, that particular shade of smoke and gold, had not appeared in the shifter bloodlines for 3 generations. And she certainly didn't know that the Alpha King's war company was less than a mile from the camp's eastern ridge, or that he had been searching for something stolen from his den for 11 days without sleep, and that the thing he was searching for was currently drooling fever sweat into the crook of her neck. All she knew was that the pup's heartbeat was getting weaker, and the nearest clean water source was the creek on the far side of the tree line, and nobody was going to help her carry it there. So she walked. Her boots had worn through at the soles 2 weeks ago. She had lined them with strips of birch bark, which worked fine on dry ground, but turned to mush in anything wet, and the path to the creek was nothing but mud and sharp slate. She felt every stone. The pup shuddered against her chest, its tongue dry as old leather rasped against her collarbone. I know she told it silently. I know it hurts. Just hold on. The refugee camp had formed 6 weeks ago at the border between the Ashwood territory and the unclaimed lands, a ragged collection of families and loners who had fled the plague zones with whatever they could carry. Ilara had arrived alone with a canvas bag containing 3 changes of clothes, a jar of dried yarrow, a bone needle, and the quarantine ward manual she had copied by hand over 3 winters, because the head healer had refused to let an Omega borrow the original. She had no wolf. Her shift had never come, not at 13, not at 16, not at 24. The healers had tested her blood twice and found nothing remarkable, just a quiet human body in a world that measured worth by the size of your fangs. In the camp she had made herself useful the way she always did. She cleaned wounds, she boiled water, she sat with the dying when nobody else could stomach it. And in exchange the camp tolerated her. Not welcomed. Tolerated. There is a difference, and Ilara knew it the way you know the precise temperature at which water turns to ice. You learn it not from books, but from standing in it long enough. The creek was shallow and fast snowmelt from the northern peaks, threading through a bed of dark granite. She knelt at the edge and cupped water in her free hand, letting it trickle over the pup's muzzle. It flinched, then slowly its tongue moved, lapping, weak and uncoordinated like a newborn, learning the motion for the first time, but lapping. "Good," she whispered. "Good, little one. There you go." Behind her, a branch snapped. She did not turn around quickly, because she had learned a long time ago that quick movements attracted worse attention than slow ones. She shifted her weight, adjusted the pup against her chest, and looked over her shoulder with the measured calm of someone who expected trouble, the way other people expected weather. 3 figures stood at the tree line. 2 of them were enormous, broad-shouldered men in dark leather armor, with swords strapped across their backs, and the dust of hard travel ground into every crease of their clothing. Warriors, the kind who moved through the world like a weather system, displacing the air around them. The 3rd figure stood slightly ahead of the other 2, and Ilara's breath stopped in her lungs. He was taller than the warriors flanking him by half a head, which put him somewhere north of 6.5 feet. His hair was black, not the soft dark of a moonless sky, but the hard black of wet iron cropped close at the sides, and longer on top where it fell across his forehead, in a way that looked like it had been shoved back impatiently 100 times and had stopped obeying. His jaw was square and shadowed with several days of stubble. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, pale and old, the kind of scar that came from something with claws rather than a blade. His eyes were amber, not gold, not brown, but the precise color of pine resin held up to firelight, and they were locked on her with an intensity that made the hairs on her arms stand straight. No, not on her. On the pup. He took a step forward, and both warriors moved with him in perfect synchronization, like shadows attached at the heel. Ilara felt her body tense. The pup, sensing the change, whimpered and burrowed deeper against her throat. "Where did you find him?" the man said. His voice was low, not quiet, but low in frequency, the kind of voice that traveled through solid objects, through walls, through bone. She felt it in her sternum before she processed the words. "Under a supply cart," she said. 3 hours ago. He was alone." The man's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, a flash of fury, so concentrated it was almost invisible there, and gone like lightning seen from very far away. He took another step forward. One of the warriors, the one on the left with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, put a hand on his sword hilt. Not threateningly, instinctively, as if the man's movement had triggered a protective reflex in everyone around him. "He has ash blood," Ilara said, because it needed to be said, because people had a right to know what they were walking toward. "The fever is in its 3rd stage. If you come closer, you should know that." The man stopped. His amber eyes moved from the pup to her face, traveling over her features with the systematic attention of someone cataloguing details for later use. She watched him take in her thin frame, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, where 6 weeks of camp rations had carved away whatever softness she had once carried, the cracked skin of her hands, the birch bark boots, the wet burlap wrapped around her forearms, now stiff and warm from the pup's fever. And then something happened that she did not expect. His nostrils flared, subtly at first, then again deeper, his chest expanding with the breath. His eyes, already intense, went wide for a fraction of a second. His pupils dilated. The warrior on the left took a sharp step back, as if he had seen something in his alpha's posture that frightened him, and the warrior on the right dropped his hand from his sword to his side, and went very, very still. The man breathed out slowly through his nose. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, still low, but rougher now, as if something inside him was pressing against the words from the other side. "You are not sick," he said. It was not a question. "No," Ilara said. "I do not get sick." He stared at her. The amber of his eyes seemed to shift, darkening at the edges, and she realized with a jolt that his wolf was pressing forward, not a full shift, but that half-state she had seen in powerful alphas, the beast rising just beneath the skin, changing the geometry of the face, the density of the air. The pup in her arms made a small sound. Not a whimper this time. Something closer to a chirp, a recognition sound, the noise wolf pups make when they scent someone from their own bloodline. The man closed his eyes. When he opened them, the darkness at the edges had receded, but his expression had rearranged itself into something she could not name. Something between hunger and grief and the particular fury of someone who has been looking for something precious and found it in the last place they wanted to find it. In the arms of a stranger. In a plague camp. In the hands of a barefoot Omega, with birch bark in her boots and burlap on her arms, and absolutely nothing in the world that resembled power. "That pup," he said quietly, "is my nephew. He is the last of the Blackmere royal bloodline, besides myself. He was stolen from my den 11 days ago by a traitor I have not yet found, and I have not slept since." He paused. His eyes moved from the pup back to her face. "And you," he said, "smell like you belong to me." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the creak behind her, every individual ripple over every individual stone. She could hear the pup's rattling breath against her throat. She could hear her own heartbeat, which had done something strange and sudden. A skip followed by a thud so hard it felt like someone had pressed a fist against the inside of her ribs. She did not understand what he meant. She did, of course, on some level, in the way that every wolf-born child understood the concept of a fated mate, the bond that the moon goddess was said to forge between two souls before birth. But understanding a concept and having it spoken to you by a man whose eyes were the color of warm resin, while you knelt barefoot in a creek, holding his dying nephew, were two very different species of understanding. "I am nobody," she said. It was not self-pity. It was a fact delivered with the same calm she had used to announce the Ashblood diagnosis. Relevant information. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged off his cloak, a heavy thing of dark wool lined with fur that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined, and he held it out to her. "Wrap him in this," he said. "It will hold his temperature better than burlap. And then you are going to tell me your name, and then I am going to take you and my nephew out of this place, and you are going to let me, because I am telling you now, clearly, and once that I am not leaving this creek without both of you." His name, she would learn later, was Cale Blackmere. Alpha King of the Blackmere Pack, ruler of the Northern Territories from the Ashwood border to the Frozen Sea, commander of 700 warriors, and the most feared shifter on the continent. Songs had been written about the battles he had won. Children in enemy packs were told his name to make them behave. He stood in the creek bed in his boots and watched her wrap his dying nephew in his cloak with the patience of a man who had decided something and was now simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Her name was Ilara, she told him. She had no pack, no wolf, no family. She was a quarantine attendant from the Greymore Pack's infirmary, and she had walked away from Greymore 6 weeks ago, when the last patient in her ward had died, and the head healer had told her there was no more work for someone like her. Someone like her. She did not explain what that meant. She did not need to. He looked at her birch-bark boots and her burlap-wrapped arms, and the way she held his nephew with the careful competence of someone who had held dying things before many times, and his expression did something complex and quiet that she could not read. "Come," he said, and she went. The war camp was nothing like the refugee settlement, where the refugee camp smelled of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of fear. The Black Mere camp smelled of oiled leather horse sweat and roasting venison. Tents stood in precise rows. Warriors moved between them with purpose. Everything was ordered, maintained, functional. The difference between a place where people were surviving and a place where people were in command. Kyle led her through the camp with his hand hovering at the small of her back, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of his palm through her threadbare dress. The warriors they passed reacted in sequence. First confusion at the sight of a gaunt, barefoot Omega carrying a bundled shape. Then recognition as they caught sight of the pup's gold-veined fur peeking from the cloak. Then a sharp, startled glance at their alpha, whose expression communicated something that made every single one of them step aside without a word. The healer's tent was at the center of the camp. Inside, a woman with steel-gray hair and hands, scarred from decades of herb work, took one look at the pup, one look at Elara, and one look at Kale, and said, "You cannot be serious. He has ash blood. 3rd stage. If that pup is unwrapped in this tent, every wolf within 40 feet is at risk." Elara waited for Kyle to take the pup from her, to hand it to the healer, or to a quarantine specialist, or to anyone with actual authority and training beyond 7 years of overnight shifts in a provincial infirmary. He did not. Instead, he looked at Elara and said, "What does he need?" It was such an unexpected question that she blinked. Alphas did not ask Omega quarantine attendants for medical opinions. It was not how the world worked. The healer, whose name was Maran, clearly agreed because she opened her mouth to protest, but Kyle held up one hand without looking at her, and Maran's mouth closed as if it had been physically shut. Elara looked down at the pup. His breathing had slowed. The fever was no cooler, but it had plateaued, which she knew from experience was either the body marshalling its last resources for recovery or its last resources for death, and there was no way to know which until you were already on the other side of it. "Clean water," she said. "Cooled but not cold. Yarrow tea, weak 1 pinch per cup, no more. A warm space away from other wolves, because Ashblood is airborne, in confined quarters with multiple shifters, and someone to hold him through the night, because pups in fever crisis who are held survive at twice the rate of pups who are left alone. I have seen it. I counted." Maran stared at her. It was the stare of a professional encountering an amateur who has just said something uncomfortably correct. She counted, Maran repeated. "I had 7 years," Elara said simply. "I kept records." Kyle looked at Maran. "Give her what she needs," he said. "A separate tent, whatever supplies she asks for. She does not leave this camp, and no one touches her or the pup without my direct permission." He turned back to Elara. His amber eyes had that quality, again the thing she could not name, the thing that made the air between them feel like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and your ears pop and everything smells of ozone. "You said someone needs to hold him through the night," he said. "Yes. Will you?" It was not a command. She heard the difference. She who had spent her entire adult life passing the tones of alphas for the line between request and order, heard the question in it. The specific, deliberate vulnerability of a man who was accustomed to commanding, and was choosing in this moment to ask. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. Then he left the tent, and she heard him outside giving orders in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, and within 20 minutes she had a small tent to herself, with a brazier for warmth, clean water-dried yarrow from Maren's personal supply, fresh linens, and a cot wide enough for her to lie on her side, with the pup curled against her stomach. She held him through the night. She held him through the fever spike at midnight, when his small body convulsed, and she sang to him, not a real song, but a formless hum, the same sound she had made for the dying patients in Greymoor's quarantine ward, when there was nothing left to do but be present. She held him when the convulsions stopped, and the silence that followed was so profound, she pressed her ear to his tiny ribcage and held her own breath until she heard his heartbeat, thready but persistent, refusing to quit. At some point in the hours before dawn, she became aware that she was being watched. Not from inside the tent, from outside. A shadow against the canvas wall, massive, and still sitting on the ground with its back against the tent frame. It did not move. It did not speak. It simply sat there, and she understood that the Alpha King of the Black Mere Pack, the most feared shifter on the continent, was spending the night on the cold ground outside her tent, because he could not bring himself to be farther from his nephew than the thickness of canvas. She did not say anything, but she shifted the pup slightly so that it faced the wall where the shadow sat, and within minutes the pup's breathing eased, as if, even through fever and fabric, and the distance between them, it could scent its own blood. Dawn came grey and cold. The pup's fever had broken by a single degree, not enough to celebrate, enough to keep going. Kyle entered the tent as the first light came through the canvas. He brought food, not camp rations, not the hard bread and dried meat that warriors carried. A bowl of porridge with honey stirred through it, still steaming, and a cup of broth made from actual bones, with actual marrow, floating in swirls of fat on the surface. He set them on the ground beside her cot, and then stood there, looking at the pup in her arms, with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Grief held at arm's length by discipline. "His name is Rowan Kyle," said. "My brother's son. My brother died in the first plague wave. Rowan's mother died 3 months later. He has been in my care since." He paused. "I failed him," he said. "You did not fail him," Ilara said. "Someone stole him. That is different." Kyle looked at her. The morning light caught his scar and turned it silver. "Most people," he said slowly, "do not correct me. Most people do not hold your nephew through the night," she said, and was surprised at herself at the steadiness of her own voice, at the way his presence, which should have terrified her instead, made her feel something she hadn't felt in so long she had almost forgotten its texture. Safe. Not protected, not sheltered, but safe in the way you feel safe when you are finally in the company of someone who sees exactly what you are and has decided that what you are is enough. She ate the porridge. She drank the broth. She continued to hold Rowan, and Kyle sat on the ground beside the cot, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched the edge of the mattress, and he told her about the theft. 11 days ago, someone had entered the Alpha's den during the night, bypassed 3 layers of security, and taken Rowan from his cradle. The only trace was a scent Kyle could not identify, masked by something chemical, something that burned his nostrils when he tried to track it. He had sent search parties in every direction. He had questioned every member of his inner circle. He had not eaten properly or slept more than 20 minutes at a stretch in 11 days, and the combination of fury and terror had pushed his wolf into a state of near constant aggression that his warriors navigated the way sailors navigate a storm, carefully, with respect for the damage it could do. But now his wolf was quiet. He said this with a kind of bewildered wonder, looking at her as if she were a door he had just discovered in a wall he thought was solid. "My wolf has not been quiet in 11 days, he said. "I walked into that clearing and it stopped. It just stopped, like it had been running, and finally found the place it was running toward. That is the bond," she said, because she was a practical person, and there was no point pretending otherwise. "The mate bond. I have read about it." "You have read about it," he repeated, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the first time he had come close to smiling in 11 days. "I read a great deal," she said. "I had a lot of quiet nights in the quarantine ward." He looked at her. She looked at him. The pup between them snored a tiny wet sound, and his fever had dropped another half-degree. The days that followed were unlike anything Elara had experienced. She remained in her tent with Rowan, monitoring his fever, adjusting his yarrow dosage, keeping careful notes in the margins of her quarantine manual, with a stub of charcoal Maren had grudgingly provided. The healer came twice daily to check on the pup, and each visit was an exercise in carefully maintained professional hostility that gradually, over the course of the first week, softened into something resembling grudging respect. "You adjusted the yarrow concentration based on his weight," Maren observed on the 4th day, reading Elara's margin notes upside down with the practiced ease of someone who had been reading other people's charts for 40 years. "0.3 pinches per pound of body weight," Elara said. "The standard dosage assumes an adult wolf. Pups metabolize differently." Maren looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you train?" "I didn't train," Elara said. "I observed. For 7 years, I wrote everything down." Maren made a sound that might have been a grunt of disapproval, or might have been something else entirely, and left the tent without another word. But that evening, a small stack of actual medical texts appeared outside Elara's tent flap, tied with a leather cord, with a note in Maren's cramped handwriting that said, "Only if you are going to play healer, at least do it with proper references." Kyle came every morning and every evening. He brought food. He sat on the ground. He watched his nephew breathe. On the 2nd day, he brought a pair of boots. Real boots, leather-lined with wool, sized precisely for her feet, and she did not ask how he had known her size, because she had seen him look at her birch-bark boots on the 1st day with an expression that suggested the existence of those boots was a personal affront to him. On the 4th day, he brought a dress. Simple but well-made dark blue wool, warm and soft against her skin. She changed into it behind the privacy screen Maren had installed, and when she emerged, Cale looked at her in the blue dress, and then looked away very quickly, and the muscles in his jaw worked as if he was chewing on words he refused to release. On the 6th day, Rowan opened his eyes. The crust had been clearing gradually, a little more each day, as Elara bathed his face with warm water and yarrow compresses. But on the 6th morning, she lifted the compress, and 2 small eyes blinked up at her, cloudy with illness but open, and they were amber. The exact same amber as Cale's, pine resin in firelight. She made a sound she had not made in years, a laugh, small and startled and genuine, pulled from somewhere beneath her rib cage, and Rowan's ears, tiny and still slightly flattened from the fever, perked toward the sound. Kyle was in the tent within seconds. He must have been standing outside. He was always standing outside, or sitting outside, or pacing outside, a 6.5-foot shadow that her tent had acquired like a permanent fixture. He looked at Rowan's open eyes, and his entire body went still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man experiencing something too large for movement. His hands, enormous and scarred across the knuckles, trembled. Then he did something she did not expect. He did not take the pup from her arms. He knelt beside the cot and pressed his forehead against her shoulder, the shoulder that was not holding Rowan, and he stayed there. He did not cry. His breathing was even and controlled, but his forehead was hot against the thin fabric of her blue dress, and his hands gripped the edge of the cot so hard the wood creaked. She did not move. She held Rowan, and she let the alpha king of the Blackmere pack press his head against her, like a man who has been drowning and has just remembered how to breathe. "Thank you," he said into the wool of her dress. The words were muffled but clear. She lifted her free hand and placed it on the back of his head. His hair was coarse and thick, not soft the way she had imagined, and she felt the tension in his neck, the cords of muscle, like bridge cables under strain. She rested her hand there, a light pressure, and felt the tension release degree by degree, like a fist slowly unclenching. The camp talked, of course. Camps always talk. She heard the whispers the way she always heard whispers, through tent walls, in the pauses between conversations that went quiet when she approached. The Blackmere warriors did not know what to make of her. An omega, wolfless, gaunt and scarred with hands roughened from years of lye soap and quarantine chemicals, holding their alpha's nephew as if she had a right to, receiving their alpha's visits as if she deserved them. Most of them said nothing directly. They were warriors, not courtiers, and they had more discipline than idle cruelty. But there was one. There is always one. Her name was Seraphine. She was Kael's war advisor, a female alpha of considerable standing, tall and sharp-featured, with auburn hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. She had served the Blackmere pack for 15 years, and she had been as far as Ilara could gather, the leading candidate for Luna, before Kyle had walked into a creek bed and found his fated mate holding a plague pup in burlap. Seraphine did not threaten her. She did not sneer or belittle. What she did was worse in its way. She was perfectly immaculately polite. She visited the tent on the 8th day with a tray of food and a smile that did not reach the thin skin around her eyes, and she said, "You must be so overwhelmed. This is all quite a lot for someone in your position. If there is anything I can do to help you feel more comfortable while you are here, the careful emphasis on the temporary, the implication light as a fingerprint on glass that Ilara's presence was a medical necessity with an expiration date. "Thank you," Ilara said. "I have everything I need." Seraphine looked at Rowan, who was sleeping in his nest of blankets on the cot, his fever now 5 degrees below its peak, his breathing steady and strong. She looked at him, the way someone looks at a lock they are trying to figure out how to pick. "He looks better," Seraphine said. "You have done remarkable work. The Alpha will be so relieved when Rowan is well enough to return to the den and things can return to normal." She smiled again. Left, Ilara sat in the quiet of the tent and felt the familiar shape of a truth she had known since childhood, settling over her like a garment she had worn thin. She was useful. She would be useful for exactly as long as the pup was sick. And when the pup was well, she would become what she had always been. Someone without a wolf, without a pack, without a claim to anything beyond the next set of soiled linens that needed changing. Except that when Kael came that evening and sat on the ground beside her cot, he did not talk about Rowan. He asked about Greymore. He asked about the quarantine ward. He asked about her years there, her patients, her records. He listened with the absolute attention of someone who was not waiting for his turn to speak, And when she described the moment she had realized that held pups survived fever at twice the rate of isolated ones, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said, "You discovered that." "I observed it," she corrected. "You observed it and recorded it and acted on it, and it is the reason my nephew is alive," he said. "That is discovery. That is science. And the fact that your pack treated you like a mop with legs for 7 years while you were doing it is something I am going to need to not think about right now, because my wolf is already trying to make me go to Grey Moor and burn it to the ground." She stared at him. He stared back, utterly serious, and then the corner of his mouth twitched again, and she realized that the twitch was his version of a laugh. The alpha king of the Black Mere pack didn't laugh. He twitched, and it was somehow the most endearing thing she had ever seen. "Do not burn Grey Moor," she said. "They have an excellent library. It would be a waste." He twitched again. Then he reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so careful and so deliberate that his fingertips barely grazed her skin and the place where they touched burned. Not like fever. Like the first warm day after a long winter, when you step into the sun and realize you have been clenching muscles you did not know you had. "You are not temporary," he said. "I need you to hear that. Whatever anyone in this camp has implied, you are not temporary. You are mine, and I am yours, and that is not a thing that changes when the fever breaks." "The mate bond," she said, because she was still Elara, still the woman who dealt in facts and records and observable phenomena. "The mate bond," he agreed. "And also just me. The man, not the wolf. Just me telling you." Rowan's fever broke fully on the 14th day. He shifted for the first time since his illness, a slow and shaky transformation, from pup to a small boy of about 2, curly-haired and amber-eyed, and so thin that Elara could count every rib. He sat on the cot and looked up at her, and said his first clear word in 2 weeks, and the word was not uncle, or water, or hungry. The word was Lara. He had been listening to her voice through 14 days of fever, through the humming and the whispered encouragements, and the quiet recitations from her quarantine manual that she read aloud, because the sound of a steady voice was, according to her own records, beneficial to recovery. He had absorbed her name like roots absorb water, unconsciously essentially, and now it came out of him, the way first words do, blunt and certain, and impossible to take back. Kyle, standing in the tent entrance, heard it. His face did something she had only seen once before, on the morning Rowan had opened his eyes. That stillness, that overwhelmed, trembling, vast stillness. But Rowan's recovery introduced a problem she had been deliberately not thinking about, and Seraphine had been right in her careful, polite, immaculate way. Things were going to change. Because Kale was an alpha king at war, the traitor who had stolen Rowan had not been found. The plague was still spreading in the Eastern Territories. He had a kingdom to run, and a war council that met twice daily, and 700 warriors who needed direction, and he could not spend his evenings sitting on the ground next to an Omega's cot forever. On the 15th day, he asked her to come to Blackmere. Not asked, stated. Then caught himself, closed his eyes, and restructured the sentence. "I would like you to come to Blackmere," he said, with the careful diction of a man who was not accustomed to using the conditional tense. "Rowan needs continued care. The plague is not gone, and his immune system is still recovering. You are the most qualified person I have ever met to provide that care, and I would like you there. In my home. Permanently." She should have said yes. The mate bond was humming in her blood, like a plucked string had been humming since the moment he had said, "You smell like you belong to me." a constant low vibration that made her skin feel alive and her chest feel full in a way she had never experienced. She wanted to say yes. She wanted it with a ferocity that frightened her. She said, "I need to think." He blinked. Once. Slowly. "All right," he said. He left. She sat in the tent and held Rowan, who had fallen asleep against her chest with his thumb in his mouth, and she thought. She thought about Greymore, about 7 years of overnight shifts, about the head healer, a woman named Aldra, who had never once called her by her name, only Omega or you there or the night girl, about the patients who died while she held their hands, and the patients who lived and were discharged and walked past her without recognition because she was part of the furniture part of the building, part of the wallpaper that you stopped seeing after enough time. She thought about what it meant to be claimed by the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, the scrutiny, the politics, the wars she didn't understand, and the court she had no training for, and the 100 ways in which she was spectacularly, obviously, unqualified to be a Luna. She thought about Seraphine's polite smile and the emphasis on "while you are here." And then she thought about the way Cale pressed his forehead against her shoulder, and the way his hands trembled, and the way his wolf went quiet in her presence, and she realized that the question was not whether she was qualified. The question was whether she was willing to be seen, really seen, not as an Omega, not as a quarantine attendant, not as a useful deficiency, but as the specific, exact person she was, with her charcoal-margined notes, and her survival statistics, and her birch bark boots, and her inability to get sick, and her 7 years of dead-of-night vigils over the dying. Kyle saw her. The mate bond was part of it, but only part. The rest was the way he listened, the way he asked questions and waited for answers, the way he said you discovered that, as if the words tasted important. She found him outside the war tent the next morning. He was in the middle of a strategy discussion with 4 senior warriors, all of whom fell silent when she appeared, a thin Omega in a blue wool dress with a sleeping toddler on her hip and a quarantine manual under her arm. "Yes," she said. Kyle looked at her. The twitch. The war council stared. Seraphine, standing at the edge of the group with a map rolled under her arm, went very still. Her expression did not change. She was too controlled for that. But her knuckles whitened on the map. "Good," Kyle said. And then to his war council, without breaking eye contact, "With Elara we leave for Blackmere at dawn." The journey took 4 days. 4 days of riding in a covered wagon, padded with furs, because Cale refused to let Rowan travel on horseback in the cold air. 4 days during which the Alpha King rode beside the wagon for hours at a stretch, close enough that Elara could have reached through the canvas flap and touched his knee. He did this without explanation or apology, and his warriors adjusted their formation around this new reality with the fluid adaptation of men who had learned that their alpha's decisions were not negotiable. On the second night, camped at the edge of the Blackwood forest, Elara woke to the sound of a wolf howling, not the camp's sentries. This was different. Closer. A single voice, low and sustained, resonant with a frequency that she felt in her teeth. She wrapped Rowan in his blankets and stepped outside the wagon. Kyle's wolf was enormous. She had never seen him shift. In the moonlight he was jet black, nearly invisible against the dark trees, except for his eyes which caught the light like 2 hot coins. He was sitting 30 feet from the wagon, and the howl was coming from him. And it was not a war howl or a territorial declaration. It was something she recognized from her quarantine nights, from the wolves who shifted in the fever ward when the pain became too much from the sounds they made, that were not for communication, but for release. A mourning howl. For his brother. For Rowan's mother. For the 11 days he had spent not sleeping, while his nephew was lost in the hands of someone who wanted his bloodline to end. He had not mourned. He had not had time. Elara stood in the dark and listened. She did not approach. She did not call out. She understood from 7 years of sitting with the dying that some grief requires a witness, but not an intervener. So she stood, and she witnessed, and when the howl faded into the cold air and the black wolf turned its massive head toward her, she nodded once. Then she went back inside the wagon, and a few minutes later, she heard the heavy padding of enormous paws outside, circling once, twice, and then settling against the wagon wheel, guarding, resting, finally for the first time in days sleeping. Blackmare was a fortress built into the bones of a mountain. Grey stone walls rose from the natural cliff face, as if the mountain had decided to grow battlements on its own. The main hall was vast and cold, lit by braziers the size of bathtubs that cast flickering shadows across stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of boots and paws. It smelled of pine smoke, old stone iron, and beneath it all the particular musk of a dominant wolf pack, a scent like ozone and cedar, and something wild and vital that had no name. Elara entered the fortress with Rowan on her hip, and the quarantine manual under her arm, and the blue wool dress that was now the nicest thing she had ever owned, and she felt every eye in the great hall land on her like a physical weight. Warriors, servants, council members, families, the entirety of the Blackmare Pack's domestic hierarchy arranged in the hall to welcome their king home, now staring at the unknown Omega he had brought with him. Kyle walked beside her. His hand was at her back again, still not touching, still close enough to feel. When they reached the center of the hall, he stopped. "This is Elara," he said. His voice filled the space, the way water fills a basin completely and without effort. "She saved my nephew's life. She is my fated mate. She will be your Luna. No preamble. No explanation. No please, or I hope you will, or we would appreciate your support." A statement of fact delivered with the same certainty he applied to military orders. The hall was silent. Then it was not silent, because a murmur ran through the crowd, like wind through tall grass, and Elara heard fragments of it, pieces of sound that assembled themselves into a picture. Omega no wolf. What is she? Quarantine, plague thin. Look at her. She stood in the center of that murmur, and she did not flinch. 7 years in a quarantine ward teaches you that whispers cannot kill you, and she had survived things with far more teeth than gossip. But then a voice cut through the murmur, clear and composed, and carrying the precise weight of authority earned over 15 years of loyal service. "With all respect," Alpha Seraphine said, stepping forward from the crowd with the map still under her arm and her auburn hair still pulled back so tightly it looked like a helmet. "The pack has the right to question a Luna's fitness. It is law, tradition. A wolfless Omega from a disbanded quarantine ward is unprecedented. The council should at least discuss this before a formal claim is made." She was not wrong. That was what made it effective. She was citing actual pack law, and the murmur in the hall shifted, and Elara saw nods. Agreement. Seraphine had 15 years of credibility, and Elara had 15 days of carrying a sick pup. Kyle's expression didn't change, but the air around him changed. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop, and the braziers flickered, as if a draught had passed through, and every wolf in the room felt their instincts twitch toward the particular frequency of alpha dominance that meant a challenge was being considered. The law, he said, carefully provides for a questioning period of 7 days, during which the proposed Luna may demonstrate her worth to the pack. He looked at Seraphine. "You are correct," he said. "The law applies." Then he looked at Elara, and his eyes were saying something that his mouth was not something along the lines of "I am sorry, and I will not let this touch you," and trust me, all compressed into a single amber glance. 7 days, he said to the hall, after which I will claim my mate. This is not a request. It is a timeline. The 7 days were harder than the plague camp. In the plague camp, the enemy was disease, predictable, observable, treatable. In Black Mirror, the enemy was perception, and perception was a thing with 1,000 heads, and no fixed body, impossible to pin down, impossible to treat with yarrow tea and margin notes. Seraphine did not attack. She organized. She convened council meetings. She raised questions about precedent. She was at every point measured and reasonable and impossible to accuse of malice, because there was no malice in her actions. There was ambition and there was self-preservation, and there was the particular anguish of a woman who had built her life around a position that was now being given to a stranger. And if Elara had been a different person, she might have hated Seraphine for it. But she did not hate Seraphine. She recognized her. She had known Seraphines her entire life, people who clawed for position because position was the only thing that made them feel safe. Elara understood that impulse. She had spent 7 years copying a medical manual by hand because knowledge was the only form of safety available to her. On the 3rd day of the 7, Seraphine came to Elara's quarters. Not to threaten, not to gloat. She stood in the doorway and looked at Rowan, who was playing on the floor with a set of carved wooden wolves that Kyle had brought from the armory relics of his own childhood, and something crossed Seraphine's face that was not anger or ambition or calculation. She watched Rowan pick up the smallest wolf, the runt of the carved set, and hand it to Elara with a grin. "He was dying," Seraphine said quietly. "We knew. The healer told us he would not survive. The alpha was—" The sentence faltered. She pressed her lips together. "He was becoming someone I did not recognize. The grief was eating him from the inside. I have served him for 15 years, and I have never seen him afraid of anything, and for those 11 days, he was afraid." She looked at Elara. "I do not like you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I do not like what your presence means for me, and I do not like the way the world has decided to rearrange itself around you. But—" She stopped. The word hung in the air. "I watched that boy die by inches for a week before you came. And now he is handing you carved wolves and calling you Lara. And I am not so far gone that I cannot see what that means." She left without waiting for a response. The next day at the council meeting, when a senior elder raised the question of whether a wolfless Omega could possibly protect the pack in a crisis, Seraphine said she protected the Alpha's heir when no one else in a camp of 300 would go near him. I think the question answers itself. The hall went quiet. The elder sat down, and the questioning period ended 4 days early. But the respite was brief because, on the morning of the 5th day, the traitor showed himself. His name was Corvin. He had been a beta in Kale's inner circle, a logistics officer responsible for supply lines, an unremarkable man with unremarkable features who had served for 6 years and who had in that time been slowly selling information about the Black Mirror bloodline to an enemy pack in the south. The Silverclaw pack, a pack that believed the northern territories were theirs by ancestral right, and that the Blackmere royal bloodline was the only thing standing in their way. Corvin had taken Rowan not to kill him, but to deliver him, to Silverclaw, to be raised as a weapon against his own family, a hostage and a tool, the last thread of royal blood twisted into a chain. When the pup disappeared, Corvin had panicked. The refugee camp had not been part of his plan. He had lost the pup during a border ambush, and for 11 days he had been silently, desperately trying to locate Rowan while pretending to help search for him. And now Rowan was back, alive, recovered, in the arms of an Omega. The Alpha King intended to make his Luna. Corvin needed the pup out of Blackmere before the formal claim ceremony, because after the claim, the fortress would lock down, and the Silverclaw army already gathering in the southern pass would have no leverage. He moved on the 5th night. Elara woke to the sound of Rowan crying, not the whimpering of a sick child, the sharp, terrified scream of a toddler being taken from warmth into cold, from safety into rough hands, from the only person who had held him through 14 days of fever, into the grip of a stranger who smelled wrong. She was on her feet before the scream finished. The room was dark. The brazier had gone out, which never happened, which meant someone had smothered it. She smelled something chemical, something that burned her sinuses, the same compound Kyle had described from the night of the theft, the scent-masking agent that made tracking impossible. A shape moved in the darkness near the window. Rowan's screams had turned to choking sobs. Elara could hear the man's breathing harsh and panicked, and she could hear the sound of a small body struggling. She did not think. There was no time for thinking. She crossed the room in 4 steps, and her hand found the shape in the dark, found an arm, a wrist, and she gripped it with every ounce of strength in her quarantine-hardened hands. The hands that had spent 7 years wringing sheets and lifting patients and scrubbing stone floors until her knuckles bled. She could not see him. She did not need to. She found Rowan by sound, by the exact pitch of his cry, which she had memorized during 14 nights of fever, and she pulled. The man struck her, a backhand across the face that split her lip and sent light exploding behind her eyes. She tasted copper. She did not let go. Rowan screamed. The man cursed. Elara pulled the child toward her chest and felt the man's grip shift, felt him reach for something at his belt, and she knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had been around death for a very long time, that he was reaching for a blade. Then the wall exploded inward. Not the wall, the door, but the force was so great that the frame splintered, and shards of wood blew across the room like shrapnel, and in the gap where the door had been stood a shape so large it blocked the torchlight from the corridor, and the shape had amber eyes that glowed in the dark like twin furnaces. And it was not human. The black wolf was in the room before Elara could draw a breath. It moved with a speed that should not have been possible for something that large, a blur of muscle and fury and teeth, and the sound it made was not a growl or a snarl. It was silence. Absolute silence. The silence of something so committed to violence that sound was a luxury it could not afford. Corvin never had a chance. The wolf's jaws closed around his shoulder, and the man's scream was cut short by the crack of bone, and then he was on the ground, and the wolf was on top of him, and Elara pressed Rowan's face into her chest so the child would not see what happened next. It did not take long. The corridor filled with warriors within seconds. Torchlight blazed. Maren appeared with her medical bag. Seraphine appeared with a sword, and Cale shifted back, breathing hard, covered in blood that was not his, and his amber eyes found Elara in the chaos of the room. and they did not leave her. He crossed to her. He cupped her face in his blood-slick hands, tilting it toward the torchlight, and his thumb brushed the split on her lip with a gentleness so at odds with the violence of 30 seconds ago that it made her vision swim. "He hit you," Kyle said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who is choosing very carefully not to lose control. "I am fine," she said. "He hit you," he repeated. She put her free hand over his where it held her face. His hand was shaking. Not from fear, from the effort of restraint. "I am fine," she said again, "and Rowan is safe. That is what matters." He looked at the child in her arms. Rowan had stopped crying and was clinging to Elara with both fists wound into the fabric of her nightdress, his face buried in the crook of her neck, the exact place he had rested during 14 nights of fever, the safest place he knew. Kyle leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a firm, deliberate pressure. Not a kiss of romance or passion, a kiss of something older and heavier. A vow. "Tomorrow," he said against her skin. "We are not waiting 7 days. Tomorrow." The claiming ceremony was not what she expected. She had read about them in texts, formal affairs with moonlit altars and ritual chants, and the ceremonial exchange of bites that bound 2 wolves together in the eyes of the pack and the goddess. Grand, theatrical, symbolic. Kyle did not do grand. Kyle did not do theatrical. What Kyle did was this. He stood in the great hall of Black Mere at dawn, with the blood still under his fingernails from the night before, and the purple shadows of sleeplessness beneath his eyes, and he waited for Elara to come to him. He did not send for her. He did not command her. He stood in the center of the hall with 700 wolves watching, and he waited. She came. She was wearing the blue wool dress because it was the only nice thing she owned, and because it was the dress she had been wearing when she told him yes in front of his war council, and she carried Rowan on her hip, because where else would Rowan be? The hall was silent. Not the silence of judgment, the silence of witnessing. Kyle looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light came through the high windows and caught the scar on his face and turned it silver, and his amber eyes were clear and steady and completely entirely focused on her. "I have a confession," he said. The hall held its breath. "When I found you in that creek," he said, "my wolf knew you first. That is how the bond works. The wolf knows. But it was not the bond that made me stay. It was not the bond that made me bring you food every morning and sit on the ground outside your tent every night. Those were choices. Mine. The man's, not the wolf's." He took a step toward her. "I chose you," he said. "I am choosing you. Not because you saved my nephew, although you did. Not because the goddess paired us, although she did. I am choosing you because you counted. 7 years in a quarantine ward, and you counted the survival rates of pups who were held because you believed it mattered, because you believed the data would save someone someday. And it did. It saved him." He looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at him with matching amber eyes and stuck his thumb in his mouth. "It saved me," Kyle said. Then he offered her his hand. Not the back of his hand, the way alphas typically offered to subordinates. His palm, open, facing up, vulnerable. The soft underside where the skin is thin and the veins are visible. She looked at his hand. She looked at the 700 wolves watching. She looked at Seraphine, who stood near the front of the crowd with her arms crossed, and her expression complicated, and her eyes, if Elara was reading them correctly, slightly unexpectedly wet. Elara shifted Rowan to one hip and placed her hand in Cale's palm. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt the bond surge, Not a gentle warmth, but a tide, a full-body recognition that cascaded from her hand, through her wrist, through her arm, into her chest, where it hit her heart like a bell being struck, and for one disorienting second, she felt his wolf and her own, and something else, something deep and dormant and enormous that stirred beneath the surface of her blood, like a creature waking from a very long sleep. The room felt it. She saw it in the way the nearest wolves flinched, the way the brazier flames jumped, the way Maren, standing at the edge of the hall with her medical bag, went pale and gripped the arm of the elder beside her. What Ilara said. Kyle was staring at her. His grip on her hand had tightened. His eyes were wide. "Your wolf," he said. "I do not have a wolf," she said automatically, because she had been saying it for 24 years, and the words came out of their own accord. "You do," Maren said from across the hall, her voice carrying with the authority of a healer who has just observed something clinically extraordinary. It was dormant, sealed, possibly from birth, possibly from exposure to ash blood at a very young age. But the bond just cracked the seal. I can feel it from here. Every wolf in this room can feel it. The dormant thing stirred again. Ilara felt it in her chest, not a heartbeat, but a second rhythm beneath the first, deeper, slower, ancient. It did not claw or fight or howl. It settled, calmly, deliberately, the way she settled, the way she had always settled into the hardest situations, quiet and steady and enduring. The crowd erupted, not in protest, in awe, because the energy emanating from the place where Ilara's hand met Kyle's was not the energy of an ordinary wolf. It was something Maren recognized from texts she had read once, in a library she had visited once in the Southern Archives. A bloodline that had been thought extinct for 6 generations. A wolf line that did not manifest through strength or speed or size, but through something rarer. Immunity, healing, endurance, the ability to walk into plague and walk out whole, the ability to hold the dying and not die, the ability to carry sickness without being carried by it. A shield wolf. The last shield wolf in recorded history had been a queen. 400 years ago, she had walked into a plague camp and ended an epidemic by touch, by proximity, by the simple radical act of standing among the sick and letting her wolf's immunity spread like warmth from a fire. Ilara had been doing this for 7 years without knowing what she was. Holding patience, sitting with the dying, never getting sick. The records she had kept, the survival rates she had counted, the data that showed, held patients lived twice as often. It had not been the holding alone. It had been her. She looked at Kyle. He looked at her. And for the first time in their acquaintance, his expression was not restrained or controlled or carefully measured. It was open, raw, the expression of a man looking at something he cannot believe is real, but refuses to doubt. "You knew," he said. "Some part of you knew. You kept going back to the ward. You kept holding them, because it worked." She thought about this, about 7 years of nights, about the patients who lived and the patients who died, and the pattern she had noticed, the one she had recorded so carefully in her margins, the one she had attributed to comfort and human contact. Because, what other explanation was there for an Omega with no wolf? "I thought it was kindness," she said. "I thought it was just being there." Kyle lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was he said. It was both. He marked her then, in front of the pack in the great hall, with the morning light pouring through the windows, and Rowan on her hip, and 700 wolves watching their king press his mouth to the curve of her neck and bite, not hard, Not brutal, but deep enough that she felt the bond lock into place, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting her entire life, and the second rhythm in her chest, the wolf that had been sealed and sleeping, rose to meet his, and the sound she made was not a cry or a gasp, but a sigh, a release. 24 years of carrying something she did not understand, and now it had a name. Kyle pulled back. His mark on her neck was already healing the edges, closing the skin, knitting into a scar that would be permanent. A crescent of teeth marks, silvered and clean. Hers. She bit him back. She did not ask permission. She did not think about it. She rose on her toes and placed her mouth against the junction of his neck and shoulder, the place where the muscle was thickest, and she bit. He made a sound, a low exhale, almost a growl, and his arms came around her, and Rowan both enveloping them. And for a moment the three of them stood in the center of the hall in a circle of warmth so complete that the nearest wolves stepped back, not from fear, but from the instinct to give something sacred its space. The hall erupted again. Howls. Not mourning howls. Recognition howls. The sound a pack makes when it has found something it was missing, something it needed, something it did not know it was looking for, until it arrived barefoot in a blue wool dress with a quarantine manual under its arm. The weeks that followed were not easy, because nothing worth having is easy, and Elara had never expected otherwise. She learned the rhythms of Blackmere, the morning patrols and the evening councils, the politics of a pack that was simultaneously fighting a plague and preparing for war with the Silverclaw threat to the south. She sat in on war councils and said nothing for the first month, listening, absorbing filing information, the way she had filed patient data for 7 years. On the 5th week, during a discussion about the plague's spread through the eastern villages, she spoke. "You are quarantining wrong," she said. 12 senior warriors and Seraphine turned to look at her. She stood. She had the quarantine manual. She had Marin's medical texts. She had her 7 years of margin notes. And she had something none of them had: a wolf that could walk into plague zones without risk, that could diagnose by proximity, that could heal by touch. "You are isolating the sick from the healthy," she said. "That is correct. But you are also isolating the sick from each other. You are putting them in separate tents, separate rooms alone, and they are dying at twice the rate they should be." She opened her manual to a page, so worn the charcoal notes were barely legible. "Physical contact during fever crisis reduces mortality by 47%, she said. "Not between healthy and sick, between caregivers and patients. I have 14 years of data across 206 patients. The data is not ambiguous." The council was silent. "She is not wrong," Marin said, from the back of the room, and the grudging was gone from her voice, now replaced by something that sounded remarkably like pride. "I have reviewed her records. The methodology is sound. Better than sound. It is the most comprehensive plague study I have seen in 30 years of practice." Kyle at the head of the table looked at Elara with the twitch at the corner of his mouth. "What do you need?" he said. She told him. "Trained caregivers, volunteers from the pack's immune individuals, deployed to every plague zone with specific protocols for contact-based care. A network of quarantine stations redesigned around her data, supply lines for yarrow and clean water, and herself traveling to the worst-hit areas, using her shield wolf abilities to diagnose and treat and train. It was an enormous undertaking. It would put her in danger. It would take her away from Blackmere for weeks at a time. Kyle said yes without hesitation. And when a senior warrior objected that the Luna should not be riding into plague camps, Kyle looked at him with amber eyes and said, "She was riding into plague camps before she met me. The difference now is that she will have an army at her back." The plague broke within 3 months. Not everywhere, not completely, but the mortality rate in the Eastern Territories dropped by 60%, and the quarantine stations Elara designed became the standard across 4 packs, and healers from as far south as the Silverclaw border came to study her methods. Seraphine ran the military operations during Elara's absences seamlessly, efficiently, with the competence of 15 years of experience directed toward its proper purpose. She and Elara developed a working relationship that was not friendship. It was something more honest than friendship. It was mutual recognition between 2 women who understood that the world was not generous, and that survival required a combination of skill and stubbornness, and the willingness to adapt when the ground shifted beneath your feet. On the night before the Silverclaw delegation arrived to negotiate terms, Seraphine came to Elara's quarters. She carried a package wrapped in dark cloth. "For the negotiation," she said, "you cannot meet the Silverclaw Alpha in a wool dress." Inside the cloth was a gown, deep blue, the same blue as the wool dress, but made of something that caught the light like water. Fitted at the waist, silver stitching at the cuffs, simple, elegant, and unmistakably the work of Blackmere's finest weaver. Elara looked at the gown. She looked at Seraphine. "Thank you," she said. Seraphine shrugged. "It is my job to ensure the Luna represents the pack well." She turned to leave. At the door she paused. "You should know," she said without turning around, "that I requested the weaver use the same blue as that ridiculous wool dress you arrived in, because Rowan calls it your Lara dress, and he would be upset if you wore a different color." She left. Elara held the gown against her chest and felt the fabric against her skin, cool and smooth, and she smiled. The Silverclaw negotiation ended without war. Elara sat beside Kyle at the table and said nothing for the first 2 hours. And then she said one thing quietly during a break in the discussions about the plague supply lines that Silverclaw had been disrupting, and the mortality data she could share that demonstrated exactly how many wolves had died as a direct result of those disruptions. She said it with numbers, with specifics, with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 7 years turning observation into evidence. The Silverclaw Alpha, a barrel-chested man with grey temples and the eyes of someone who had seen too many funerals, looked at her data and was quiet for a long time. He signed the treaty the next morning. On the night after the signing, Kyle found Elara in the nursery. Rowan was asleep in his cot, fully recovered, growing fast, shifting between boy and pup with the easy fluidity of a healthy child. His wolf was smoke and gold, the royal Blackmere colouring, and when he shifted in his sleep, his small paws twitched as if he was running through dreams. Elara sat beside the cot in a chair she had moved there on her first night in Blackmere, and had not moved since. Her quarantine manual was open in her lap. She was not reading it. She was looking at Rowan. Kyle sat on the floor beside her chair, the way he had sat on the ground beside her cot in the war camp shoulder, nearly touching the armrest. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. "The treaty holds," he said. "Silverclaw withdraws from the border. The supply lines stay open. The plague response continues." She nodded. He opened one eye and looked up at her. "You ended a war with a spreadsheet," he said. "I ended a war with data," she corrected. He twitched. They sat in the nursery in the quiet of the fortress, and outside the window, the northern sky was clear for the first time in weeks, the stars sharp and hard as salt crystals against the black. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a sentry on the outer wall, and the sound rolled through the mountain and faded into silence. Rowan stirred. His small hand reached out in his sleep, searching, and found the edge of Ilara's sleeve. His fingers closed around the fabric. He settled. Kyle reached up and took her free hand. His fingers laced through hers, rough against smooth, scarred against, weathered the hand of a king against the hand of a quarantine attendant, and they fit. She looked down at their joined hands. She looked at Rowan's fingers on her sleeve. She looked at the quarantine manual in her lap, the one she had copied by hand over 3 winters in a ward where no one knew her name, the one with the margin notes that had ended a plague and prevented a war. The brazier crackled. Rowan's breathing was steady and slow. Kyle's thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand, absent and automatic, the gesture of someone who has found the exact place in the world where their body is supposed to be and has no intention of moving from it. She closed the manual and set it on the floor beside her chair. She did not need it tonight. The data was done. The numbers were written. The evidence was catalogued and recorded in charcoal margins and survival statistics, and the steady heartbeat of a sleeping child who was alive because she had picked him up when no one else would. She leaned her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes, and Kyle's hand tightened around hers, warm and certain and permanent. And the wolf inside her chest, the one that had been sleeping for 24 years, settled deeper into its rest. Not because it was tired, but because for the first time, it was home.